I'm here on the Fox Den with Gym Class Hero, who also, we're going to use her nickname D. So, hey, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Tell us a little about why you chose that Twitter handle, Gym Class Hero, and your actual is at crushing_goals.
Yes.
So what's the origin of your name?
It definitely started off as an accountability for myself, to also hopefully inspire others. And as the name suggests, to get into better shape and to get fit. So that was kind of my thing, and to just go for goals and just obliterate them. So it was kind of a combination. I actually have had a few different names on Twitter, and that's just the one I ended up sticking with.
That's great. So one of the main reasons I wanted to interview you is in your bio, it says that you are a mental health advocate, and a lot of your posts are geared toward that, and you retweet a lot of people. So I wanted to talk about how physical and mental health correlate here, because there's a huge correlation. We know that exercise is extremely helpful in alleviating depression. So
yes.
Just really quick before we get into some of your own personal history, this might actually be a good time to do that. So what pulled you into the world of exercise?
Initially, it was just ready to make a physical change, knowing that, I have my child who will need me forever. As you know, she has Down syndrome. And she was my main motivation. I also am fairly medically minded. And I did know about the studies that correlated exercise, mental health, and having a diagnosis of major depressive disorder and PTSD myself from my time in service. I knew that logically this would probably be another great way to help, increase serotonin, decrease anxiety.
What got you into the military?
9/11. I had absolutely no desire prior to that. I had school paid for. I was a scholarship. I just bought my first home. I was promoted to a managerial position. I had pretty much everything ready to go. I had no reason to leave. 9/11 happened, and I left a few months later. It just stirred something in me that wanted to do and serve something larger than myself. So I left everything and rented my home out and whatnot, and didn't tell anybody, and shocked everyone that knew me. And I left. So that was the reason.
What branch did you end up serving in? What did you do?
So I chose the Army because it was the oldest branch, and I chose military police because I've always been fascinated with law enforcement anyway, and it was the toughest job at the time for a female to be able to do, and I really wanted to test my limits.
Wow, okay. So as comfortable, you don't have to share anything you don't want to. Talk to us about PTSD, because that's a big thing that I work with in my own practice with clients. That's a single episode and complex post-traumatic stress disorder are things that I see a lot of. So
absolutely. Yes. No, I don't mind at all. I feel like, especially with the platforms that we have, being an open book, as much as you feel comfortable, can really benefit other people. So even if I have to be vulnerable and opening myself up, if it could help even one person, to me, it's worth it. So no, I don't mind talking about it at all. And in fact, I'm actually part of a PTSD clinic as we speak, and I'm working with a therapist that deals strictly with trauma. So I'm learning some great coping mechanisms myself. I'm still very early in my stage, but anything I can do to help others. So yeah, I mean, my PTSD was actually undiagnosed for probably a good 8 or 9 years. The thing about between my childhood and the military, it's all about Stoicism. It's all about holding it together, being strong, and really not showing a lot of that type of emotion, especially with the job that I had being a first responder, preparing for war, that kind of thing. You can't let emotions really override anything that you're doing. It's all about the mission. So you become very numb automatically. You just do your job, you go through the motions, and you suck it up and drive on. That's actually a phrase that the Army says. So when trauma does happen, you're already kind of in this robotic state, which works really well for that environment you're in. And a lot of veterans and first responders will probably relate to this. But when you're out of that, let's face it, we're mostly made of emotion. And if you can't switch that off, you become extremely detached and unable to deal with anything. So that's kind of what happened to me. And I was having serious mental health issues and I didn't know why at the time. So that's how detached and what a lack of insight it can give you if you don't even, you're not properly. And I was actually misdiagnosed multiple times with other disorders, medicated for them. It was really bad. So I went through.
Go ahead.
Sorry. No, that's fine. That was it.
What did they think you had before PTSD? What on earth?
Oh, so one of the very first diagnoses was bipolar disorder, which I don't have.
Well, that's
but because
wrong.
Yeah, because I'm normally a very positive, optimistic person. I always have been. So when that severe depression would hit, when that numbness would hit, they'd be like, okay, this is and of course it was also the VA. They don't want to take responsibility for anything that might have happened during your time in service, because then, there might be a compensation question at that point. And so, yeah, that was one of my other diagnoses. So I was actually put on all the mood stabilizers and a bunch of stuff I shouldn't have been on. But at the time I was so detached, I said, I'll take anything. I don't care. I just want to feel better. What's wrong with me? I'd never had issues before. And all of a sudden I couldn't concentrate. I was losing jobs. I mean, this had never happened to me. I'd always been extremely ambitious and everything came easy to me. And all of a sudden I lost all these skills. And I said, what is wrong with me? So for years I had no idea. And it took a really good therapist to actually say, hey, do you think your team being killed in Iraq had anything to do with maybe what you're feeling and what you're avoiding? And that's actually what happened. And so I said, what? No, people have had it so much worse than me. Why would this create PTSD? Like it didn't make sense. Like why me?
Right.
There's people that have been through way worse. I said, that's not for me. I just need to suck it up. I'm fine. And he's like, no, you have survivor's guilt. Like this is part of what could happen. Plus you saw all these things when you're in and you see some traumatic stuff just doing your job that you're doing. And I was like, gosh, I guess that's right. But I didn't believe it because I thought there's just so much worse out there. So it took me quite a while to even accept that diagnosis.
That is disappointing, but also indicative, I think, of a lot of different veterans and first responders experiences, right?
Absolutely.
How long were you with the Army military police in all?
A few years. I was actually injured and I was a medical discharge. I wasn't even found fit for duty at the end, which was really unfortunate. And that's why I also wasn't able to deploy with my team, because I started getting evaluated for a medical board before they left. And once that happens, you're non-deployable. That started maybe a week and a half before we were supposed to be deployed. And 3 weeks later, they were killed. And these are the people I slept with, I trained with, I lived with. Basically, we were family. Your brothers, your sisters. You would die for each other. And for me not to be in that same truck that I was supposed to be in with them, it didn't realize at the time, but I felt a tremendous amount of guilt for not living up to my obligation, what I thought is my obligation as a soldier, not being strong enough physically and emotionally just to go. Emotionally, I was fine to go. I shouldn't say that. Physically, they would not allow me to go, but I wanted to.
They ended up in one of those rides passing away, and you would have been there. Is that what happened?
Yes. So that was not only was it my squad, it was my team. And in the Army, they have, your platoon, which is a larger group. Well, you have your company, then you have your platoons, then you have your squads, then you have teams. And there was a team I was one of 4 in one truck, the only female. I was supposed to be so there was the driver, my platoon sergeant, my squad leader, team leader, and then the gunner, and then me. So I was in the back, supposed to be in the back on the left side.
Wow. Okay.
This month is actually the 17-year anniversary. So I always have a hard time around this time of year because, triggers, anniversaries, a lot of people with this understand that too. So
absolutely. So we'll kind of pivot the conversation here. That's so interesting that it was not considered kind of the first diagnosis, right? I mean,
no.
The part of it is, if we don't tell people, if the intake staff, if the assessment staff don't know that's what happened, and you just give your symptoms, then they may look at it that way. But it's the job of the mental health professional to probe and say, okay, is that something you noticed since childhood or adolescence, or is that something that you can attribute to an event? I mean, very simple questions that you can ask that would help people to connect the dots on the fact that it's trauma-induced symptomology.
I didn't accept that. That would have been my diagnosis for a second, because I said I wasn't physically there. I
Right.
don't deserve that diagnosis. I am being a wuss right now.
Okay.
So I had no self-compassion. That's something I'm still working on, to be honest.
Right.
And it was more of like, you should have sucked it up. You're fine. You weren't even there. What is wrong with you? Why are you having nightmares about this? Why are you feeling guilty about this? Why are you doing this? And the worst part is I saw pictures of their injuries and what happened to them. I mean, I had to inform their families. I had to see the daughter and the wife. And I mean, so I was in the rear detachment, and I went up to the wife, and my squad leader was only 30. My friend was 19. And the 30-year-old left an 8-year-old daughter behind, and his wife. And I went up to his wife, and I was just so numb. And I just said, I should have been there. I'm so sorry. And she just said, get away from me. And it was just, and then in the military, you can't even cry in uniform. I mean, there was just a lot of like things being held back. And I was just so detached by the time I got out that I just was totally numb until I'd have a nightmare or something, and you know, something would trigger me. But for the most part, I didn't even think about it. I removed myself so much from it because I think there was so much pain that I couldn't process. I've never grieved. So that's what I'm actually working on as we speak. So it's like,
wow,
it's been 17 years next month that I've been, you know, so it could take a long time.
That it's amazing that you're working on it now, though. And I think with the right treatment, I'm biased, I have my own recommendations, but go ahead.
I've done a few treatments for PTSD. I've done prolonged exposure therapy. I've done cognitive behavioral therapy. I've done relaxation classes. I've actually been in therapy since I was active duty in 2003, on and off this whole time. And
have you done EMDR?
I've done a little bit of that as well. That's
the stuff.
Okay, I'll look into it more. And of course, I'm only with the VA, so I just go with what they have. But
no, I get it.
My roadblocks have been, I have a logical sense. I have insight, at least now. I do not believe it for myself. So my challenge is to overcome those obstacles of actually stopping these negative thought patterns, and stopping the blame, and stopping the guilt, and and actually just looking at it more objectively, and which I can give anyone else great advice, but taking it yourself when you feel that responsibility is really difficult. So that's always been my challenge.
Right. Well, and so let's get to that. This is such a great conversation, because I respect cognitive behavior therapy. I think it's a great adjunct when it comes to trauma treatment for people with emotional distress. I wouldn't only focus on that. That would be that's my perspective clinically, because like that, you know, logically you didn't do anything to deserve this guilt, but it's a sub-logical, very subcortical set of impulses that are causing that guilt. It's more limbic system driven, fight or flight response.
Right.
PTSD people can look back and they see these events as things that happen to them, and they don't feel like they're active agents in the process. And so EMDR can kind of recalibrate those memories. Very powerful. And there's a lot of VA departments that actually have clinicians who are trained in that. I don't know in your area or not, but I will say that for anyone who is frustrated because repeatedly telling yourself that you're not to blame, or you know that you deserve self-care, for anyone that's failing, that's not catching, you know, your thoughts and emotions aren't congruing, or cohering at some point, it's not you. It's because it's a deeper issue in some more primal brain networks than our frontal lobe, where a lot of logical thought happens, right? And with trauma, that's very relevant. And the book, The Body Keeps the Score, is a very good read on that, by the way. It's got lots of info in there about how trauma affects the brain, not just the logical sense, but overall. And the body. I mean, it's got body in the title. And it's about the hypervigilant sense. And so that avoidance, well, it's interesting because you talk about avoidance, right? And so the avoidance is what is spurred on by the reliving symptoms. And so there's this what was called an ironic process, where the more you try to avoid it and the more you try to not think about something, the more it comes up. And so that's also relevant.
Absolutely. Totally. And I think the lack of self-compassion piece, the the avoidance. I mean, it's just this vicious cycle, and a lot of life events have happened to me recently that would be also considered somewhat traumatic maybe.
Oh no.
And I just, yeah, so, but it's a good thing because I've been really, really forced to be alone with my thoughts. Like, I'm newly separated after almost 18 years of marriage. And we have a great relationship. We're still best friends, you know, just, we were so young. We actually met in the military. So what was happening even just a few weeks ago, I was really spiraling into extremely deep depressions. And why? Because I ran out of distractions. And I was all of a sudden alone with my true thoughts, and it was beyond scary. And I've been hospitalized before I was diagnosed, especially. I mean, I've actually been to that point, and it really scared me. And I said, I can't do this. I have too much to live for. I know that. I need to, you know, I said, I'm tired of running. I'm tired. I'm so tired. You can only hold it in for so long, and then what? You just go until you crash, and then you crash. And so I told my therapist this. I said, listen, I do have more alone time now. I'm not a full-time caretaker every day like I've always been for over 11 years. And I said, I think I'm ready to finally address what I've been running away from this whole time. And so we talked about how we could do that because of my previous, you know, failures in my head. I'm such a perfectionist that does not help. And I have a lot of labels, all or nothing thinking, very common. So not being able to live on these things, just being so harsh on myself. So we talked about redefining values, redefining words, something as simple as strength. For me in the past, it was always lock it up, the Stoicism, don't show emotion, don't be vulnerable, don't be weak. So I've been doing this my whole life, and then the military just kind of reiterated what I should be doing. She goes, now look at a new definition. I said, you know, strength was leaving a marriage, you know, amicably together. Strength is saying, I'm ready to address this head on. And strength might be showing emotion. Maybe that's my new definition of strength. And so I think a lot of people that maybe are stuck on old values or old ways of thinking, or she even said, none of us are the same even from 5 years ago. It doesn't matter if we've had trauma or not. Life experiences will still change who you are in some way. We're always evolving. There's never one way of being, and that's okay. And you know what? If I'm not going to be all or nothing, if I can just meet in the middle, I know I'll never be cured. I'll never be perfect. I'll never be the way I was, but none of us are, right? None of us are what we were. She goes, if we can just kind of meet the old you, new you in the middle and come up with a new definition of what you find to have a meaningful life, and we can kind of put those two together and give you those coping skills. So that's kind of where we're starting, is the very basics of redefining values and how you define what makes you you, and then you can go from there, because that's always just kind of been my issue. Like, yes, I know all the therapies, yes, I understand that it's not my fault, but I don't believe it. So now it's like, how do we kind of get that basis, you know, that foundation for you to actually start implementing, and not just saying, yeah, I know, and then not doing anything because you don't believe it. It's like telling yourself a lie over and over again. There's no point in any therapy if you can't actually look at yourself with that love and say, you know what, this could apply to you.
Yeah, I think you said it succinctly and perfectly. It's really interesting to see the different therapeutic styles people have. And all of them have some fragment of the truth, I think. You know, some therapists stress self-compassion or self-care, and others may stress taking action, right? And so there's a time and place for all of those different attributes and elements. So before we started rolling the recording here, you were saying that words come up twice now, at least: stoic, you know, stoicism. It's interesting. As an adjective, it means to be emotionally repressed, even, not just controlled. Absolutely. But as a noun, stoicism is the entire school of thought we know that proliferated in Greece and then was taken up by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who I recently looked into because of one of my other podcast guests is an esteemed author about stoicism. So give us your take on Stoic thought and how or how not it's helped you or clouded your vision of logic and rationality.
Sure. I believe it's actually assisted me in a lot of deadly situations that it could have potentially turned a lot worse if you were overly emotional, especially being a police officer. I've seen my daughter almost pass away multiple times. I've had to react very quickly in emergency situations for her. Yeah, she's had 20 surgeries, and she's had a lot of medical problems. So I've actually seen her stop breathing. I've seen some pretty bad things with her, but I've been able to stay calm, do what I had to do at the time. And, being in law enforcement, I saw, a lot of injuries. I saw death. I saw very similar things that you would see as civilian, except you're dealing with active duty and dependents, and you have to be clear-headed no matter what you come across. And so I think in those instances, the military is very great at training you to remove yourself emotionally from those things. If you imagine if someone was overly emotional in war, I mean, you get yourself or someone else killed. So there's a time and a place for it, absolutely. Also with, my daughter, if I was overly emotional and freaking out, I mean, she could have already lost her life because I wasn't able to react in the right way. So for me, Stoicism means, really kind of being able to detach yourself emotionally. And I think there is a time and a place, to be honest. And I'm sure a lot of people in the medical field will feel the same way, doctors, et cetera. So I don't think it's healthy as a total way of thought, in my opinion, because I do feel like it is repressive. And for me, it's actually been a problem because I could go from that, but I'm not able to come back to a more normal state of being and processing. And for me, being that way actually really prevented the emotional processing, and then I would just kind of have a breakdown. So I didn't have the balance, and that's what we're kind of working on now, is to turn it on when I need to, because let's face it, I have to with my child, and to really kind of be able to come back from it though too, and not to just let it be so extreme on either end of the spectrum.
It's interesting to hear that, because have you ever heard of dialectical behavior therapy? It's a bit, okay, so it's a big movement that's for people with severe, well, it was pioneered for people with borderline personality disorder. So
okay,
for severe,
that's another diagnosis they thought I had when I was medicated for. So I forgot to mention that was another one.
It's interesting. Well,
I don't have it.
So oftentimes bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder are confused and misdiagnosed for one another.
Yes. Right.
That's an understatement.
Yes.
And one involves, they both involve a lot of emotional dysregulation, but the causes and the clinical manifestations are different. The telltale sign is the mania isn't there with borderline personality disorder.
Yeah.
It's a constant emotional vacillation versus a sort of episodic, manic presentation, and then depression and mania. Anyway, but so dialectical behavior therapy introduces this idea of, and you could say it revives the idea really from a lot of classical traditions, of wise mind, of emotional intelligence plus logical intelligence together equaling wisdom. And so
I like that.
When you have, I figured, because it's applicable to your situation. So when you have nothing but the logical assessment of the present, and without the awareness of how things are presenting emotionally or how they might be interpreted, and that's just one side. But then only emotional awareness on the other side doesn't have any sort of practicality to it that's binding it like what the rational mind could offer. So together those two are very powerful. So one of the big things in DBT is this idea of it's an intervention of just the facts, like just explain the facts. It's like, well, this happened to my team, so that's the fact. The value judgment is I should have been there, or I don't deserve to feel pain for it, and so, or
I should have been dead. I shouldn't even be alive right now. Yeah,
so that's clearly a cognitive distortion. We know that, but that emotional component, getting away from you and turning into this whole affective realm of guilt, is really problematic and difficult. And so there's a difference between logical assessment of the present and denial of the present, and so I think in the military you have to be aware of what's happening. It's okay, this bomb just went off and here's what's happening. But it doesn't do you any good to deny it. And so the denial element is what leads to trauma and that lack of your brain updating to, okay, this happened, I couldn't have helped it, it's over. Do you see what I'm saying? I think that denial of the present versus stoicism, those two, like, you can be emotionally aware, or you can be aware that emoting at the moment may not be the best option. And that's having kind of a stoic philosophical mindset to it, that this is what's happening, I'm not good, having that wise mind and that just the facts mentality, but then denying it, saying I'm fine, everything's going well, and suck it up mentality. that creates a sort of temporal distortion in your own brain where you don't even acknowledge that it did happen. Not that it happened and you're not going to emote on it, but that it didn't, like just not even acknowledging it.
Talk about detachment. Absolutely. And the more you avoid, like you had said, the more really it's just on the forefront. It's going to be
Right.
there. You're either going to face it or you're not. But when it's so painful that you can't or you won't because you're afraid of losing control or, you know, whatever, then really you've never moved on from that very moment. You're frozen in time. And that's the best way I can describe PTSD is you're literally frozen in this moment of time that could a trigger can send you right back even more so to that very second. And it's just like, you've just never left it, you know, and it's just as raw and real as it is that day it happened all these years later. Vietnam vets especially, as I'm sure you're aware of, dealt with it way worse than our generation because it wasn't even recognized back then. They were not welcomed. There was no patriotism for them at the time, and talk about locking it up. And they just recently started, you know, seeking help, and these guys are in their 60s and 70s. So, I mean, I think it's just, there's a lot, depending on the environment that you're in, especially whether it's familial or, you know, your job or whatever it might be, that wolf pack mentality of keeping it that way can really permeate you even more. And then no matter, even if you're removed out of that environment, no wonder veterans have such a hard time transitioning, because all of a sudden now you're a civilian again, but you're really not. Because those pathways have been developed, that training is always there. And it's like, this is why so many veterans have such a hard time, because it's just a different world. And all of a sudden now you're thrown back into like a typical life. It's like, you don't really know how to adjust anymore. And so even if you didn't have trauma, I mean, you're still dealing with some very unique ways of behaving that maybe other people can't relate to, and you can't relate to them. And then you become more isolated. It's just this cycle that could happen. So I've seen that happen with a lot of veterans as well.
Absolutely. The avoidance cycle is immediately gratifying, but ultimately traumatizing.
It's not sustainable either.
No,
I mean, let's face it, it's not. It's just not.
Well, and you can look at the nature of, and this kind of gets beyond even the scope of the conversation, but the nature of warfare and not knowing if you're driving down the road, an improvised explosive device is going to explode, right? And there's like no delineation of where the battlefield ends in different wars now. Vietnam is where that really started.
And being in law enforcement, you're paranoid of everybody and everything. You're talk about hypervigilance. You are on guard. You have your weapon with you at all times. You are ready to go. To this day, I have a hard time with crowds. To this day, I very rarely trust people right away. I have to really vet for people, because it's like, well, how do I know you're not going to try to kill me? Or it's like, and so you unfortunately kind of carry this like suspicion, the hypervigilance, and you know, you're just ready to go at any time. I sleep with one eye open. I mean, it's just like those things just never leave you. So even if you're like, oh, I'm in a relaxed place, it's like, okay, but I need to watch the exits. I need to make sure this isn't going to happen. And I've been told many times, well, anything could happen. You're right. But what are the actual statistical chances of this? And I was like, I don't care. It could happen. And to me, that's enough. So it's like, you could just never really relax, you know, and that's always a hard time too for a lot of people like me that are like ready for something to happen. I got my gun, let's go. And you just can never just let it be and let it go. You're just ready, you know, at all times. So
I think that's a big part of it. That's where positive exercise and physical activity comes in, right? It's like you send your body the signal that you're safe and that your heart rate is up from exercising. So that the reason the trauma doesn't leave your mind is because the body, when you have this thought of lack of safety, you go into this mode of responding that goes back to your training and to what you had to do in previous situations. And then that reinforces the mind's, as you said, kind of paranoid sense of danger. And then, you know, it's that loop. And so good trauma therapy addresses physical reactions always. It has to do that.
Yep. And even with my daughter, it's a different animal in a sense, but it's the same, where I am hyper vigilant with her because of medical. And
and you can talk about that too.
Yeah, it's like it's very similar. My therapist even said, she goes, it's almost like the military just carried on over to your daily life because it had to. And so it's
generalization.
Yeah, it's even harder to break those habits now, because there are times I have to be. I mean, my daughter has so many medical things that it's like, if you're not waiting for the next thing, then you're going to miss something. So there's a lot of pressure to, really be on top of it, and you can never just kind of let your guard down, because as soon as you do, you might miss something. And then physically, there's things that could happen to her in the blink of an eye, that if you're not micromanaging every single thing she does, you could miss that and she could get seriously injured or killed. So, I mean, it is kind of a life or death thing, almost on a daily basis. She has so many things that have happened to her, and so many different things that are going on, that if you're not watching her like a hawk, I mean, something really awful could happen, and it has. So then you can never just be like, so it is kind of nice that I share half the time now with my husband, because when I don't have her, and she's with him, and I don't really worry, because even at school I was worried, and I mean, she's actually been really hurt at school, so it's just been super scary. So it's like, okay, now I have no excuse to not really address these things and become just a more balanced and freed, I just need to lift this weight. I need to grieve. I need to honor my team. I can't carry this with me forever to the extent that I have been. And I can't keep blaming myself, because you just drive yourself crazy with the what ifs. So I'm trying to get away from that. So you're literally coming at me when I just started a more intense version of therapy, and it's been years since I tried the prolonged exposure or anything like that. So yeah.
You have to be careful with prolonged exposure, because EMDR is not just exposure. It also involves reprocessing and that sampling of present safety, and a lot of other exposure therapies, meaning with the eye movement, you're noticing that you're safe and in the present. Okay. But with other therapies, the entire goal is to feel like you're in the trauma, which, don't get me wrong, is a huge element of EMDR. That's why it's something that only trained professionals who have like master's degrees, or who are nurses or whatever, have medical degrees, can receive education in, because it's very powerful. But the whole operating principle of EMDR is dual awareness of safety and of past trauma. So when it comes to, and I'm not bad mouthing it, I think that some of the desensitization stuff is amazing, but it's not everything. And it can be done where someone actually just fears doing the therapy, and that's
what happened to me. So I actually started with prolonged exposure, and it was so intense that I actually switched over to CBT.
Yeah, I've heard cognitive processing therapy. Okay.
And that's what I did the last time. So that was more written based. They used
Tell me how you liked that.
I liked it better than the prolonged exposure, because there was less talking. And for me, though, it was easier to detach, because I'm writing. Yeah. So, it's less intense, and it's for people that, like me, that couldn't handle the PET. So this was actually kind of a better way to do it. The problem that I had, even though I completed it, was just not actually believing any of it for myself. At least I gained the insight, though. I saw where my obstacles were, and I was at least able to kind of see where the detachment was, and where the disassociative, between heart and mind, type where the problem with connecting the two. So that's the benefit I got from it. And just to really kind of break down those negative thoughts, break it down to a more, logical, manageable level. But then the emotion part, I just couldn't connect. So at least I gained that from it. And that's kind of what we've realized, that at least I got something. But as far as implementing it, I didn't do it. Didn't do the exercises after I was done, because I didn't believe it. So I was just lying to myself over and over again. In my head, I was going, it is your fault. It is your fault they're dead. You did not do what you should. No, it's not at all. So it's like, that's where that self-love piece has to come in, and just say, listen, you did the best you could. You had no choice. You had no control over this. You were hurt. There's nothing you could do. There was nothing you could do. And if you were there, maybe you wouldn't have been able to save their life. I did have one therapist that went he went a very harsh route, and it actually made me feel worse. But it took a really good therapist later to figure it out. What happened
there?
So he's used to dealing with addicts. And so he used a very interesting approach that you would normally confront a drug addict with, which I've never had a problem with. And he said, I just said, at the time I wasn't diagnosed with PTSD either, but I was talking about their death, because I had a feeling something had to do with it. I kept having nightmares about it, and I would trigger with uniforms and just different things. And I said, I don't know. And he goes, did you really think that you're that good of a soldier, that if you were there, you could have saved their lives? And I was like, well, now I don't. But he basically was like a very confrontational thing. And I was like, oh my God, I really was a failure. I probably couldn't have. And he's like, yeah, you made it. You probably weren't even that good. You were hurt anyway. what do you think you would have done something differently? And I'm like, I guess not now. Gosh, I already felt bad about myself. Now I really feel bad. But yeah, I told my next therapist that, and he goes, that was definitely the wrong approach to use with you. You already felt guilty. That's approach you use with somebody else that's denying their responsibility. You're doing the opposite where you're taking it all in. So that kind of messed me up a little bit. That was years ago, but I still remember him saying that to me and just the look on his face. And I was just like, wow, I feel so, this is bad. He's right. So yeah, you definitely need to have a therapist that you could trust and that you feel safe with, because that's not what happened to me with him, unfortunately. But I just took it because I didn't have a voice at the time. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I gave whatever the VA gave to me. I said, okay, I'll take it. So he was one of them.
And so he had a gruff expression and was not.
He was very confrontational with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I didn't know it at the time.
Well, it's interesting, and for listeners, I mean, there's always a good balance between stereotyping anyone, right, and including therapists,
right,
and
yeah,
understanding the likelihood that they're going to have a certain approach. Okay,
right.
so there's a middle ground there, like a middle ground of like being open-minded and thinking, well, they're going to be totally different than other addictions therapists, and then thinking, okay, stereotypically, this is what addiction therapists do.
And he's not even an addiction therapist, which is the funny part. He's not. That's just the tactic he used. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
He's not. No, he's with the VA, and he was actually a clinical psychologist that worked with depression and anxiety. He was not an addiction specialist. That's just the approach he used with me. And that's what my next therapist told me, who was actually his colleague. And he said, no. He goes, I know exactly what he's doing there. And maybe there are veterans that are addicts. I understand that, especially Vietnam, alcoholism and all that's very common, and even with my generation. But he's like, you are not one of them. I was like, I don't know. So that might have just been his normal approach. But yeah, that's what my therapist told me later. He's like, that's not the approach to use with you. But there's different approaches for different patients. I totally get that, for sure.
Right. And so there is a sort of tough love approach that many addictions therapists take.
Yeah, you have to. A lot of them are in denial.
It's an interesting field. I think that again, there's a lot of trauma there, and that when you only give people a Band-Aid for a serious wound,
yes,
there's going to be a lot of relapse, and then that's going to be viewed as willfully choosing not to apply the tactics and techniques of therapy, which might there's different techniques, as many almost as there are personality types. And so if something doesn't work, well, it's time to try something else. And so that's where clients can become extremely crestfallen and discouraged, is in thinking that they're just not trying it hard enough, or that they can't do it. And it might not be right for an avoidant presentation of PTSD, to go back to your case. So anyway, well, this is all really, I think, applicable stuff. People, especially now that they're at home with their thoughts a lot, and that they are probably unable to avoid.
Yep.
They have that.
Isolated. Yes.
Yeah.
This is not a good time for people that have the depression or anxiety. And my recommendation is to reach out, because this is kind of your own worst nightmare if you're someone like me, when you've tried so hard to avoid, and you have all these distractions, and all of a sudden those were gone. And it's like, now you are truly alone with your thoughts, and you really don't want to be. You need to have someone help guide you through that in a safe way. And
there's a lot of therapists now who have gotten good with teletherapy, like what we're doing now on Zoom.
That's what I do, actually. The VA's been doing it with me for years, because at one time I was so isolated, and so it was bad enough that I actually really never left the house, minus appointments for my daughter. So I actually couldn't even go to the VA anymore. That's how bad my church. Yeah, I was basically housebound, minus my daughter's stuff. So I started
agoraphobic, nearly.
Yeah, absolutely. I started telehealth. Yeah, even leaving, I would get like a panic attack. Xanax with me all the time. So I started telehealth probably 6 years ago. They've had that quite a while now with the VA for the PTSD clinic, because I'm not the only one that has a hard time leaving the house.
I'm glad to hear that they're able to meet veterans where they are. Literally.
Yeah, literally. Yes.
That's impressive.
But my therapist now actually wants me to come in face to face, because she says when we start getting more deep into the trauma, she goes, it's going to make a difference. Yeah. So I'm sure you agree with that.
I do agree with that 100%. So but you know what? It's going to be incremental, and you're going to develop each step along the way, you're going to have more resilience. And so it's not,
Absolutely.
you're not going to be able to imagine it now because we
No.
project our current emotions into the future. We
I've
do
already
that as
lost
people.
control. It's scary. Yeah, I don't want to be like I was in the hospital. So it's like,
Oh,
that's my
absolutely.
biggest worry. So she goes, I remember a great therapist I had before I moved where I'm at now, the same one that finally diagnosed me properly. He goes, this isn't like a soda bottle that we shake up and just open up. He's like, we're going to do slow incremental changes. We're going to slowly open that bottle up. So
Yep.
you're not going to feel out of control.
That's key
Like,
with trauma. Absolutely.
absolutely.
100%. So this kind of paves the way for a good question. What sort of exercise, and we can have kind of like a multiple parts to this question. Like what sort of exercises physically, just
Mhm.
fitness wise, have been most helpful for you to feel in control of your body? And what now with people being homebound,
Yes.
do you recommend as an exercise routine? And you can kind
Sure.
of, if you're comfortable with that. I know
Oh,
it's a big question.
yes. No, it's fine. So I think, especially for anxiety, I feel any kind of, heavy cardio, heavy weights, body weight, anything that's going to really kind of be a little bit on the running on endurance side. I think that really kind of helps get a lot of that that feeling of just being so pent up and like so restless. Anything that's going to be higher intensity, I feel like really does help to kind of help with that anxiety to a certain point. Obviously, you don't want to get too revved up if you're already anxious. But for me, if I'm feeling restless or I'm feeling like, oh my God, then for me, running has been very helpful. Lifting heavy objects. My daughter also has sensory processing disorder, which is, I'm sure you know, is a neurological disorder affecting
Right.
so the vestibular system and whatnot. And even with them, when they're a little out of sync, they recommend heavy work. They recommend pushing something. They recommend lifting something. And so depending on where you're at, whether you're overstimulated or understimulated, and let's say if you're so anxious, maybe yoga or something. So it really just kind of depends for me, like on that level, how anxious are you? Because of course you don't want to get too like revved up. So it just kind of a balance thing. So for me though, it has been running, it's been, yoga, it's been a combination of those things and heavy lifting. It just really depended on my mood, I think, at the time and what I felt like my body needed. And then as far as what I'm doing now, I'm still able to do some of the cardio, a lot of body weight stuff, and improvising with like a loaded backpack, and then doing, weighted squats or hip thrusts or dips. You could do all of that by adding extra weight, a weight vest to kind of simulate lifting dumbbells if you don't have them. So those kinds of things. Or taking gallon jugs of water. You could fill them with sand. There's just ways to be creative. You don't have to have a gym to do these things or to be in shape.
That's amazing. Okay. So people can get very creative with that. I like it.
Oh, totally. And there's a lot of people that I follow on my Twitter that basically do home workouts already and have been for quite a while. You've probably seen some of them. JT is one of them. He has a great YouTube channel as well, full of home exercises that mainly focus on body weight. There's really no excuse even now. So if you can have the willpower and be creative enough, you can still stay in fairly good shape. So I've been focusing now like on, push-ups, squats, sit-ups, planks. I have an exercise ball you could do a lot with, and running when I don't have my daughter. But I have pushed her in her wheelchair. She's 96 pounds. Her wheelchair is about 30 pounds. And if you're pushing all that, going up hills and down hills, you'll get a really nice workout even with your kid if you can do it. So.
Wow. Tell us a little bit about what it's been like to this journey of becoming an advocate for special needs too, because I think that's something that has been and that's permeated a lot of our conversation here.
Yeah, it's
Is
always
how
good
you
to
went
have
from the
her.
military to the hypervigilance involved with being a parent of a child with special need. Any encouragement you have for people out there with children who have unique, cognitive or physical challenges?
Oh, so many. I was very young when I had her. We did not know about her diagnosis until she almost died and was in intensive care. And then we found out she had Down syndrome. I was only 23 when I got pregnant. It wasn't even a worry or concern. So I did not handle it well at all in the beginning at all. I told my husband, even I said, I can't do this. I can't be her mom. Like, I'm just not good enough. This is right after the military too, by the way, that we got pregnant. So it was just bad timing altogether. Was not diagnosed. It was just bad. And I said, I'll just give her to you. I just can't. And he goes, honey, it's okay. We'll wait for you. I went through an extreme depression because obviously I wasn't on my meds at the time either because of being pregnant, and it was really bad. So I went through these huge lows, and then I just kind of looked at her and said, you know what? there's some light, but unfortunately my advice to parents, especially with a new diagnosis, is the doctors, the medical teams are typically going to be more negative than anything. They're not going to congratulate you on the birth of your child. They're going to say, I'm sorry, your child has this. It's like, but they're still here. Like, can't you congratulate? My daughter made it. But it was never a happy event. It was just like, well, but she has Down syndrome. She's going to have this. You have to go to do this. And in a way, you're mourning that loss, even though your child's still physically here. You're mourning a loss of a sense of normalcy that you thought you were going to have. So that expectation of what you imagined her life was going to be, in my case, is gone. What I thought was gone. Not going to get married, not driving, not doing this, not going to give me grandchildren, all these things that you think of, oh, I'm going to have a girl, it's going to be like that, or a boy. So that was all gone in my head. This is also before I learned about the syndrome and that, she can have an amazing life, but not to take away from the worry, because there are a lot of things that, can happen. She has most of the issues that they can get. She has heart disease, thyroid disease, hearing loss. She has cataracts at age 10. She got them. I mean, she's extremely high risk for leukemia, extremely high risk for Alzheimer's. And those are my biggest fears for her. Her lifespan's not going to be as long as mine, most likely. And that just really creates a lot of sadness and worry for me. At the same time, I don't want to die before her, because she's going to need me at all times. She's 13, but developmentally, she's like about 2.5. I mean, she can never be on her own. So my advice to parents is to, one, listen to your doctors, but also don't, because they can't predict their futures. And at the same time, connect with other families that have a similar diagnosis, because they are going to be the better teachers anyway than, someone that maybe doesn't deal with this on a daily basis. So I just think the more research you can do, yes, because I do a lot of medical as well, but also connect with families and kind of get to know them on that personal level. And you're really going to need that compassion and support and true empathy for someone that truly knows what it's like. Because otherwise you're going to feel very isolated, and it's just going to make a lot of other things worse. And that's kind of how I felt, especially because all my friends were having kids. And at my age of 24, no one was having babies with disabilities. All my friends had typically healthy, normal children, right? And so then I was just kind of like,
caused that? Was there
with Down syndrome, it's just one of those anomalies that happens at conception. There's nothing, there's no way to predict or control. 95% of the time it's maternal in origin. There's 3 different types of Down syndrome, as I'm sure you're aware of. My daughter has the most common form, which is trisomy 21, the complete trisomy 21. So she has a full complete extra chromosome in that 3rd set. She has in the 21st set. So she has 3 chromosomes instead of the average 2. So she's not missing, she has extra. So she has 47 chromosomes instead of 46. A few other types of Down syndrome are the translocation, and then there's the mosaicism, which are more rare, but it just depends on how that chromosome breaks off. And in her case, it's just the complete. But the risks, the health issues can all be the same. So there's just a lot that you have to keep up with. And as she ages, there's going to be more. And everything she has now, none of it's going to go away. So it's just, you're just kind of adding on. So it can be very stressful for that. And so I always just kind of try not to worry about her health and say she's healthy right now, but it's hard for me not to live in the present sometimes, between avoiding past and then worrying about the future. So this, like, you're trying to really,
Of course it is, right.
Be in the moment, It's hard for people like us, for sure. But that have all these other things that we're avoiding.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it's really helpful to have that community with parents who understand what it's like. And like you said, to connect, to realize that with medical language now, and I think that with some, hopefully, providers and with different professionals who have more of a strengths-based and positive psychology perspective, using the I'm sorry, but, and then explain the condition. It's interesting how far we've come from that in the psychotherapy realm, but how in the medical model that's often not a priority. And I understand that
makes sense
when an entire profession like therapy is built around communication, right, and on people's emotions. But then in the medical field is around some extremely high risk intensity situations, and saying things in a perfectly appropriate, affirming way isn't always the priority when you're trying to save lives. I get that.
It's a very similar thing to the military, where you're there to do a job and you can't be overly emotional. So I understand that, the delivery of such news and the way they told me that my daughter had Down syndrome was not very, was very
trauma informed.
Yeah, it was pretty bad. It was, especially when I first found out she was in intensive care, it was very matter of fact, which I understand why they have to be that way. It just, yeah, I just wish kind of was, it'd be nice to have maybe the social worker come in at the same time, or, that would be great. Which I did talk to them later, but it
There you
wasn't at the
go.
right time. Yeah. So I think that's a nice way, if we can have that balance of, yes, we have to be this way to do our job, but let's also kind of bring in more of that emotional piece when we're dealing with things. So, and the sad thing is too, is a lot of babies like mine, during an ultrasound, if they do get a diagnosis, they're almost immediately offered abortions without any referrals to families, without saying, well, these are your options. It's more of like, well, we could do it then. Would you like to come in next week and just take care of it? I mean, that's literally, I have friends that
That's
have
triggering.
children. It's pretty bad. And it's like, I think part of that is the ignorance, and in the medical community, there's a lot of biasm, unfortunately, with people that aren't considered perfect. And it's sad because we live in this day and age where we're supposed to be accepting. And I almost feel like sometimes we're going back to, Hitler era, where there was euthanasia. We're basically trying to eradicate these populations of people that are considered undesirable. That's really what it is. And it's a whole nother subject, I know, but it's like
Eugenics.
these people, yeah, absolutely. The funny thing is like people with Down syndrome in particular are the only population of people they can definitively research Alzheimer's disease research on, because 100% have the plaque tangles of the brain associated with it. About 50% or so get it fully, but almost all will start to have symptoms very early onset. They're actually working on a vaccine now with people with Down syndrome, and it's going to possibly help the general population. So that's just one thing, but there's a lot of other things that happen with other conditions that can be researched to help other people. We kind of need to see that there's a benefit for them, not just personality wise, but in a medical sense too, to help others. But that's a whole nother thing. But so that's where my advocacy comes in, because it's like, not only is there a lot of ignorance surrounding a lot of diagnoses, but at the same time, it's like, there's also, it's not a death sentence. It's not this horrible thing. I mean, it's going to be hard, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, the best thing, the biggest blessing, I was a very impatient person before I had her. And trust me, if you're still potty training a 12-year-old at the time, you have to be patient. If your child's not walking and they're 4.5 years old, you have to be patient. So there's also some really great benefits just to help you be a better person. So I see new babies. I've actually been trained as a new parent support specialist to go into hospitals and speak to new parents like me that maybe didn't handle it so well, because it's not all rainbows, and it's okay to feel that way. You don't need to feel guilty for feeling bad or being depressed. I had one lady, I called her, she never called me back. I call her maybe once every month or so, leave a message, just want to let you know I'm thinking about you. That's it. I didn't hear from her for 2 years. And then one day she finally called me, and to this day we're really close friends. But some people just need to know you're there for them. And some people aren't okay with it, initially, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people. You just hit on the importance of giving yourself permission to be upset. As a parent, that's amazing. Yeah, I really think people need to take that to heart, that you're not a terrible person if you're overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Right?
Or
I hear that a lot. I've heard a
Wish.
lot from female clients who felt guilty that they didn't right away feel a real kind of Disney princess story, fairy tale connection to their kid, like after delivery. And I think it's
right.
a mild trauma there and a kind of derealization, and then you have to kind of calibrate. It's not the same for everybody.
No.
For all women. So anyway, this is good. Tell me what 3 people you would meet, living or dead, to get in a room to talk. That's the quintessential Fox Den question there.
I have such varied interests, so it's probably going to sound very strange.
No, that's good. The stranger the better. That's the point. It's the synthesis of ideas.
Right. So I really have a lot of respect and admiration for Dwight D. Eisenhower. I think he was an amazing historical figure, a war hero, president. He enacted so many different laws that I feel really helped. But just overall, just such a tough, you're like, just, oh my gosh, like I love people that have ambition, that are really strong. Iron sharpens iron. So that would definitely be somebody that I would love to speak with. I also have a fascination with Freddie Mercury. I think he was just one of the best male vocalists of our time. And he was so complex though too, as a person. And I just would he lived in such a bad time, as far as acceptance is concerned. And I know he didn't have the easiest life, and he was very introverted and shy. He had this other persona, but he was obviously very much at war with himself. And I would just love to speak to him now and just kind of see how things have changed for him, and maybe his life would have been better.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just find him super fascinating. He was such an amazing talent. Um, Third person though, I don't even know, there's so many people that I'm just like, I'm into medicine, I'm into this, I'm into that. Just anyone I think that maybe has pioneered for advocacy for people with special needs. So I know the Kennedy family has been really big on that, and I really appreciate, especially for decades ago when acceptance wasn't a thing and they were institutionalized, or there, anyone. So anyone that worked with Special Olympics and Best Buddies program, and just anyone that's really kind of been a pioneer for those with special needs, I think just, I would love to speak to them and say thank you, so just to be like, because of you, my daughter is able to do this, and she's living longer and she's having a better quality of life than she would have. So yeah, so there's so many people in that realm. I couldn't pick just one. So
No, that's great. That's fine. That is an eclectic mix to your varied tastes and advocacies. So
yeah, I love music. I come from a musician type family. My dad's a professional musician too, so music's like another one of my
oh, really?
passions.
What does
Yeah,
he play?
He's a guitarist, and I used to sing with him. We do a lot of jazz, Otis Redding and Roberta Flack and Nat King Cole. Yeah, I started gigs with him when I was 14, and then I used to play piano by ear. And my uncle was part of the Righteous Brothers and the Knickerbockers. He was the drummer for them.
That's
His
a
name
big
is Jimmy
deal.
Walker. Yeah, and then my stepmom, not by blood, but my stepmom, her dad was Trummy Young, and he used to play with Louis Armstrong, and he wrote songs for Billie Holiday. And so I love jazz. I love Yanni. I've seen him in concert. I love EDM. I love classic rock. I love classical. I love just like a little bit of everything, alternative, So, yeah, music's another one of my loves. Janis Joplin.
EDM, huh?
Yeah, I love EDM. Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
too. That's
Do
funny
you?
to bring that up.
Which band, what groups and bands,
Oh
DJs?
man. So I would have to say one of my favorite EDM artists is Zed. He's a great producer.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
I've seen
yeah.
him. I saw him in 2015. That was one of my
Nice.
first EDM shows that I really went to. That was great. The
Such
light.
cool vibes. The crowds are amazing.
It's really funny because people will think EMDR, the therapy I do, they'll say EDMR. I'm like, look, that's cool in a lot of fronts. So Zed is great. I like but Electric is a good one that's lesser known, and I think he's French. Black Tiger Sex Machine is a really big one that's
Haven't heard that
cool, that
one.
comes to Denver, and they have a
Okay.
very up tempo. I like some of the fast tempo stuff.
Gotcha. So
That's
more like the techno based versus like trance, or
no, yeah. So
gotcha.
that's a good way of
House.
putting it. Global,
House.
yeah, Deep House. I saw
Yeah.
Tiesto. He's great.
Oh yeah. I like Tiesto.
Skrillex is really good.
Yes, I love Skrillex. I love that deep bass, like yeah, I love that. Bass Nectar is really, like, I have a friend that's obsessed, and I guess
I
he's
should
going
have
to
said
be
that first because I've seen Bass Nectar twice. He's good. He blew out
nice.
people's windows in Denver at the Sporting Goods Stadium, so he's not. They weren't going to have Bass Center there anymore. It wasn't allowed. He also terrorized Red Rocks with the volume level, which is just fine with me because in Denver, Red Rocks is a big venue.
Oh, gotcha.
It's an outdoor one. It's within the big red rocks there. It's why it's called that. So some of the shows become extremely loud to the point that they break noise ordinances, which that's really good. So that's you have a friend. Bass Nectar fans are really ride or die.
Yeah, they are. Oh, this girl's like obsessed. Like, she follows them all over the country. Like, she's like true groupie. Yeah. So and it's funny because my daughter she likes Kygo. I like Kygo too. Like
I saw Kygo.
Deadmau5.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite.
Yes.
He's probably my favorite. I've seen his Cube the Cube with the animation on it. You need to seen his stage show, a huge LED wraparound screen. Anyway, what were you gonna say? Your friend?
Oh no, that was it. No, that was it. I love all that stuff. So yeah, I just think and what I like about it too is just like the crowds are just, I don't like crowds, but depending on what type of concerts you're going to, like, it's amazing the different vibes that you can get from just the people that are around you based on the music alone and just kind of who's there. And I don't know, I just felt like I've been to raves and stuff too, and everyone's just like, I mean, they're probably all on drugs, that's probably why, but everyone's just like, hey, like, cool, they back, like, what's up? It's just like nice. Everyone's pretty loving for the most part. So I think that's what I like about it too. It's kind of like a little community when you get into the EDM scene, I think.
Well, you're right, and people don't have to be on ecstasy to
it helps, but yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
MDMA is being used
Yes,
for
for
better.
PTSD.
Yeah, that goes all the way back around to what we were
I
talking
know.
about. It's funny how that
I
works.
I would be very open to it in a clinical setting. I don't know how much fun it would be. It's not like you're gonna have glow sticks or anything, but I was looking to that. I also heard a lot of good things about microdosing, depending on what you're doing. So I mean, I'm pretty open to different things like that. I am prescribed medicinal cannabis. I have been for 2 years now. That seems to help a lot as well. So
I've heard good things about pharmacological interventions for people that may not have been considered that um, contemporary back in the day
right.
or acceptable. But ketamine is another one. In
Yeah.
Boulder, there's a
Oh, I didn't
psychiatrist
know
who's really
ketamine.
big on that.
Okay. I mean, I know what it is. I just didn't know
Yeah,
that it was used. That's
it's
interesting.
being used for unresponsive depression, I think,
Mm.
or what we could call kind of severe
Resistant.
unremitting.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'm familiar. And actually I'm off all depression meds because I just came to a point where they did nothing for me. It was affecting side effect wise, it wasn't worth it anymore. I would get really lightheaded and I'm up and down all night with my daughter anyway. It was not helping. So I was like, "Ugh," and even Ambien wasn't knock me out for sleep. And I said, there's just no point in me taking these meds. But the anti-anxiety meds definitely were needed at times because if you're about to have a panic attack, you need something. Like I just didn't have the tools at the time to bring myself
right.
down.
Tell us about like what though that's really important to hear. I think that validates people a lot.
Yeah.
What are some favorite activities you do or participate in for mental health, and what accounts do you like on Twitter for that topic?
Yeah, that's tough because I've been so isolated for so long. So I'm like, hobbies, activities, when you have, especially that other point of depression, it's like
Right.
it's hard, to try to get yourself back. But when I am having a good day, I really enjoy spending time with people that I feel comfortable with, that I feel accept me despite my flaws, because I think that's so important to have at least one or two people that you really truly feel accept you, don't judge you, that you can, whether it's a therapist, a family friend, whatever it might be, just to have at least one person that you can truly count on. That's a nice reciprocal type relationship. Um, so I highly recommend that. I know it's so hard for people like us to reach out. I don't like to burden others. I like to try to do it myself and be positive. I don't want to be a black cloud. But the thing is like people love you. They care about you. You're never alone. And people need to remember that you are loved. And if you only saw yourself the way other people see you, maybe so really reaching out to other people has been instrumental. And
Love
then the
it.
other Twitter accounts, I really thrive on positivity. But at the same time, I feel like in my case, I've relied on my optimism almost as a crutch. So there could be a balance with that. I feel like it's good to kind of be real. And people have seen me on my account where you're so happy, you're so this, but they've literally seen me cry. And I said, listen, I don't normally do this, but I just want to let you guys know it's okay to not be okay. And if anyone's
It
struggling, you're
is.
not alone. So Twitter accounts, I'm trying to think of people
That's
I could.
okay. That was kind of a
Yeah, but anyone that really kind of is real, and anyone that's a mental health advocate, I think is great, because just to kind of see people's sides, different sides, we all have them, and to know that that's normal. That's part of the human experience.
right.
We're multifaceted, and that includes
Right.
our emotions, and that's okay.
That's true. It absolutely is. So as we kind of wind down here, tell me what are some pet peeves if you have it? I mean, you hit on a lot, right? Like the idea, the get over it mentality is
Yeah.
certainly problematic and not something that you're fond of. But can you think of any
Yeah.
other sort of
Actually,
mental? Go ahead.
no, mental health stigmas or stereotypes.
Yeah, or even approaches that you don't see that work that well within mental health, that within that world.
Hmm. I mean, as an individual or therapeutically.
Oh, let's say either or.
Okay. As an individual, I feel a huge roadblock to most people with mental health, either seeking treatment or acknowledging their own issues, is the stigma that we have as a society on mental health issues. And it prevents so many people from seeking help. We're not screening for these things like we are physical health. We aren't talking about it. we aren't dealing with it. And as a society, this isn't even, it doesn't go to an individual level. So whether it's an environmental thing from your childhood or just being out in the world, I think one of my biggest pet peeves in general is just the shame that a lot of people feel, and the guilt, or the, just,
Right.
I think we need to talk about it, and we need to let people know that this is normal. This is okay. And the things that have happened to you, it's a normal reaction, and it can happen to any of us at any time. And I think that was part of my biggest roadblock, was not acknowledging that this was a normal reaction for someone that went through what I went through, or anyone else. So I think that comes the stigma that comes with the suck it up and be tough, whether, especially if you're a man, especially if you're a certain ethnicity, especially if you're a veteran, especially, I mean, there's just a lot of stereotypes that go with certain kinds of people and groups. And I think we need to just dispel these myths and say this could happen to anybody.
Agreed. That's such a beautiful place to leave off. I think when it comes to men and their mental health, there's a conflicting cultural message of share, but then like don't share stuff, but then,
Man up.
not too much. Right. And so there's that sort of dichotomy, that double bind, we would call it clinically, of conflicting messages that can cause some real neurotic responses there.
Yeah,
And
look at
I think
suicide rates of men.
right.
They're more likely to carry it out. Why?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's great to call attention to that. So anything you want to add? We covered a lot, and I think it was a really illuminating conversation for people.
Good. I hope so. Yeah, I'm all over the place. No,
That's
just
good.
yeah, I think just to just really remember that there's people that love all of us and care about all of us, and even if it's a stranger, it's amazing the connections you could make just by reaching out, asking for help. Yes, there's some negativity, but I think there's always going to be more good than bad in the end. Just got to find the right people.
That's right. Hang in there, everyone.
Yeah.
You always feel free to reach out. This has been the Fox Den.